Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Safer Tomorrow podcast. I am Dr. Joe. And before we dive into today's episode, I want to address something very important. So, we had some technical difficulties, and I would like to apologize for any inconvenience caused by the choppy audio and the disappearance of the interviewer's video. As a podcaster, I strive to deliver the best quality content to you, my valued listeners. However, this particular episode was incredibly valuable. And so, despite the technical flaws, I decided to still share this episode. Please understand that these technical issues do not reflect the usual standard of the podcast. We're working diligently to have smoother recordings moving forward. But in the spirit of transparency, this topic was so important. I really believed it was important to share with you. I appreciate your understanding and patience. Now, let's dive into today's session. I'm sure you've heard many discussions, or perhaps been a part of many discussions about the root causes of crime. But have you ever wondered what actually helps people to stop committing crimes? Are you curious about what policies will be effective in reducing and helping to assist individuals to reduce criminal behavior? What strategies can policymakers implement to bring about meaningful change? Today on Safer Tomorrow, I'll be talking to Professor Fergus McNeil about why people stop committing crimes and what effective policies can be used to support them. Join me today. Hi, and welcome. I'm Dr. Joe, and this is the Safer Tomorrow podcast. Today we have Professor Fergus McNeil with us, and trust me, I am so excited because as a researcher, I've known his work for about a decade now, and I it has helped to shape some of my own beliefs about how people live a life of crime. And today we're going to speak a little bit about how and why people live a life of crime, as well as how we can create effective policies to support people who um, to support persons living this life of crime. Welcome, Professor McNeil.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here and nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you. So before we really jump in, I really wanted to just share a little bit with my viewers and listeners about your experience in rehabilitation and criminal justice social work and how you ended up in this field of desistance from crime, which we'll talk about a little bit more.
Okay, sure. Well, this is a long time ago now, making me feel very old. But back in the late 80s, that's 1980s, I finished my first degree at university, which was in history and philosophy, which I enjoyed. But I wanted to do something practical and also to test out my personal beliefs and values at that stage. So I was placed in a drug rehab by a kind of matchmaking organization that connected young
Yeah.
people with opportunities for learning and development. And I was supposed to stay for 1 year. It was residential for me as well. So I lived in alongside men in recovery from long-term problems with drugs or alcohol. In the end, I stayed for 3 years. So I lived in the drug rehab alongside people in recovery for that length of time. And yeah, it was a huge privilege to be there alongside them on their journey. And I think I learned a huge amount in that time and developed a lot as a person. And obviously it also stimulated my interest in actually in mental health, in substance misuse, and in criminal justice. All of those things were kind of milling around in the context of the drug rehab. When I came back to Glasgow, I came back to study the Masters in Social Work at Glasgow University. And it was during the placements on that course, the practical placements, that I was really introduced to the sort of sharp end of the Scottish criminal justice system. I particularly
Mm,
remember the first time I was asked to write a pre-sentence report to give guidance to a judge about how to deal with a woman who had been convicted of fraud. Um, and that experience was profound for me because I realized that everything I learned in my philosophy degree and from my practical experience was now being brought to bear on a key decision that was going to influence the life of this person and her children. And the quality of the report also depended on my ability to engage with her, to understand her, to learn from her.
Mhm.
and then to try to use all the material to gently and respectfully lead a judge towards a just sentence. So that really hooked me deeply into criminal justice as a site in which many of my wider interests in justice and fairness could be explored. And when I qualified, I went immediately into what was then called social work with offenders. Now it's called justice social
Mm.
work, and it is
Yes.
effectively the equivalent of probation or parole. We did both, in fact, so supervising people on community sentences and after imprisonment, as well as writing those reports for judges. And I did that for 5 years in one of the highest crime, highest punishment communities in Scotland in the East End of Glasgow. In fact, we sent more people,
Mm.
not me personally, but my neighbourhood sent more people to prison per capita than any other neighbourhood in Scotland. And obviously, it
Wow.
was my job to try and do something about that. And I worked at that for 5 years and then did another master's degree, which specialised more in criminology and got hooked into what I could learn from criminological and sociological research. And
Mhm.
then, to cut a long story short, in '98, a job came up at Glasgow to teach people training to be social workers about criminal justice. And there were very few jobs of that nature, so I thought I'd better go for it. And
Mhm.
I've been there ever since, although I don't actually train social workers anymore. But
Mm.
I'm still researching and studying and consulting and trying to shape policy and practice in relation to how we get better at doing justice to people in our communities.
Yes, and you have done so much work in this area. And as a fellow social worker,
Hmm.
I mean, I'm really just grateful to hear of your background, because I really believe that social workers really have a big role to play in this area of criminal justice and crime reduction, and particularly in the area of desistance from crime.
Hmm.
Every time I mention the word desistance, people are like, "Huh? What? Resistance? What does that mean?" And so it is definitely. I mean, when I was doing my masters, I was like, I had this notion about love and crime, as you would know, and but I had no words for it. And after doing some research, eventually I found the whole concept of desistance from crime. One of the things that we tend to think about more when we think about crime reduction is we always speak about the root causes of crime. And so we believe that, okay, if we just focus on the root causes of crime, then people will desist, people will leave this life. Can you tell us a little bit more about what desistance from crime means? And just take us a little bit into that world.
Okay. Well, my kind of simple definition of it is that desistance is um, a process of human development, but one which takes place and is inevitably shaped by its social context. And that process takes people, as you say, away from crime, but also importantly towards social integration. And
Mhm.
that matters because ultimately, I think it is social integration which has the crime preventing effects. So mostly our prison systems and penal systems, I think globally, are overpopulated with people who are socially disintegrated,
Yeah.
disengaged, marginalized, excluded, stigmatized, alienated, and it's the lack of strong ties between those people and communities, and also, frankly, the fact that they have little to lose, um, and little to lose by offending, and not much to gain by trying when
Yeah.
the cards seem to be stacked against them. So that's basically how I would see desistance. There is a slightly more subtle but important distinction between three aspects of desistance, which I think is quite helpful. So we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary desistance, and that
Mhm.
means essentially primary resistance is about the absence of offending behavior. So it's to do with a person's conduct, plain and simple. Secondary resistance, though, is to do with a person's identity. So,
Yeah.
do they see themselves as having left crime behind and as moving forward into some more positive kind of identity? And thirdly, tertiary resistance refers to social reaction to that person's attempt to change. And ultimately, it relates to the question of whether or not a person secures a position of belonging and acceptance within a community. And as I've already said, it's that moment when a person feels stable and secure, respected and valued within a community. You used the word love in your research, and I think that that's a good word. When a person feels that and is bound by it, then their behavior change is secure and established and can be relied upon.
Yeah. And one of the things I really like about your research, and that generally I think is important, is the notion of the wider community participating in this process of desistance from crime. Because um, quite a lot how we view persons leaving this life of crime, we think about it as either the state's issue. The state
Mm-hmm.
has to intervene. If they don't intervene, then nothing will happen. Or the responsibility is the individuals. They have to be in charge of their change alone, right? Because they have to participate and they have to lead it in one sense.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not the only ones. The wider aspects of society need to be involved. And so, I mean, you speak about psychological rehabilitation in your research, but then you also speak about three other types. Could you unpack that for us a little bit, please?
Sure. So, psychological, or sometimes I call it more generally personal rehabilitation, is
Mm,
to do with personal development, with a process of education, in which a person acquires new skills, new behaviors, new attitudes, perhaps. And that could be related to specific programming in prison around offending behavior. There's specialist courses, as you'll be well aware, that are often provided in, at least in some states, to help people directly address the offending behavior. But vocational training and education in the context of prisons and penal systems also contribute to this wider sense of personal development. The issue, though, is that just because a person has the capacity to act and to live differently and the capability to do so isn't enough. That
mm,
in and of itself doesn't secure integration, because my integration depends on you as much as me. So
mm,
I can be ready, I can be skilled, I can be willing, I can be able, but I can't make you accept me, and I can't make you give me opportunities to fit into a community and play a role within it. Neither can the state, incidentally. The state can move resources around, and it should move resources around so that communities are enabled to support and accept back their own people. Um, but the state can't prevail upon one citizen to accept another. If it could, that would be a kind of dystopian, totalitarian state that we wouldn't want to live in. So
mhm,
for me, in between the state and the individual citizen, both of whom do have responsibilities, is the responsibility of civil society, meaning any kind of association that we form as human beings. It could be in our families, it could be in our neighborhoods, it could be in our churches and faith groups, it could be in our businesses, in our colleges, in our clubs. You know, in any civil society association, there are resources and opportunities for people to relate to one another. And if we deny some people access to civil society, then they remain excluded and they can't secure their desistance. And incidentally, that's as bad for us as it is for them, because if we leave them in that kind of limbo where they're trying to desist, but nobody's giving them a break or offering them an alternative to the lifestyle that they've been trapped within, then it becomes much more likely that their desistance effort will fail. Not because of a lack of willpower or a lack of goodwill or effort on their part, but because we've refused to allow it to happen by dint of our persistence in excluding and marginalizing them even after their formal punishment is completed.
yeah.
So that's social rehabilitation. And I've also added into the model legal rehabilitation, which is about the formal process of re-qualifying as a citizen. So when you've done your time and your debts are settled, you should have the same rights as every other citizen, I would argue. And then there's a final dimension which is important, which is moral rehabilitation. And this accepts the fact that while the state can put a person through a criminal justice process, that often doesn't provide an opportunity for a victim or an affected community to actually feel that they've been heard, that their pain has been taken seriously by the offender, and that change has happened, and there's a reason to re-enter into a social relationship with that person. And sometimes that kind of rehabilitation needs to be mediated. And I think restorative and reparative approaches to criminal justice are important to create a moral climate within which communities are willing to accept people back.
Can you share a little bit more about what you mean by restorative and reparative?
Sure. So reparative, I would say, is a broader school. So let me just define it by contrast to what I would call punitive justice. So
Hmm.
if in response to somebody harming us, our instinct, understandable instinct, is that they suffer. That's sometimes our first instinct, sometimes one that we would like to think we've matured beyond, but it's a very persistent human feeling that we want to hurt those who've hurt us. So we ask our criminal justice system to do that, and it obliges, it imposes pain. Um, of course, that pain doesn't actually help us repair. It doesn't do anything to address the losses that we might have experienced through the crime. But what it does is it incapacitates, damages, and disables the person that we're inflicting suffering upon, making their journey to reintegration more difficult. So actually, when we respond with that instinct to essentially to do violence to those who've done violence to us, I think we tend to make matters worse. By contrast, reparative justice says, okay, we have to take this harm really seriously, but we should try to do that in a way which repairs as much as possible the harm that the victim has suffered and the relation, the social relation between the offender and the victim and the community in which that's taken place. And within that broad reparative model, restorative justice is a set of practices and a philosophy, I guess, which takes different forms in different places and is much written about, much debated. But essentially, it involves a dialogue process between victims, offenders, and communities whereby there is discussion of what has taken place, there's acknowledgement, ideally apology, and then some dialogue around how exactly the offender might seek to repair harms where that's possible. And also, it can extend into a discussion of how the community can facilitate in that process so that there is restoration for the victim, but also reintegration for the offender through that process.
Okay, thank you. I know one of the main challenges that we as members of civil society face is just the fear factor.
Yeah.
Um, you know, some of these persons, not they haven't necessarily committed one-off offenses, right, which have their own unique cases and description and perhaps background, but some of the persons who have who are re-entering society have participated in many violent criminal activities. How do we bridge that gap in terms of dealing with that fear?
Yeah, I accept that that's a reality which has to be confronted.
Yeah.
And I should also make explicit here that I am no expert in the context of crime problems in Jamaica or in the Caribbean region more broadly. So I don't want to pretend to have more answers than I do. But what I can say is that I've met many people who've committed extremely violent offences over the years, both as a in the drug rehab, as a social worker, and as an academic. Um, and as I have got to know them better, my sense that there is a distinct population of people who are violent and a population of people who are not, to me that myth has been busted by experience.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure what we can generalize in that. I think that not everybody wants a career in social work or drug rehabilitation or criminology. So the extent to which the general public can experience the ordinariness
Mhm.
of people caught up within the criminal justice system perhaps is somewhat limited. But I think nonetheless we need to find better ways to educate the public about what brings people into criminal justice and how patterns of violence emerge in childhood and through the life
Mhm.
course and are reinforced by criminalization and penalization rather than undone by it. Um, I think the more
Mhm.
that we can communicate about that and fundamentally help bridge the distance, the social distance between the those that are selected as offenders and punished as such, and those that regard themselves as law-abiding and sometimes it seems to be sinless. The more that we can narrow that gap, the better chance we have of working towards reintegration and safety. So the way that fear is reduced, I think, ultimately is through encounter, and encounter
Mhm.
can be mediated in different ways. It can be face to face in some contexts, but it can also be through a range of different forms of media, the sharing of stories. In the Scottish context, we've done a big project over many years to do it through collaborative music making and song sharing in public contexts, which bring the stories of justice affected people to the general public, and maybe make them seem less distant and less different. Um, it can happen through literature, it can happen through television, and it can happen through film. The problem is many of the representations we're exposed to tend to reinforce and exaggerate our fears rather than reducing
Alleviate them.
them. So we
Mhm.
need counter narratives, if you like, and other representations of people's stories that can help to uh, bust a few more myths.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So in the desistance literature, we'll see that hitting rock bottom or having very difficult experiences during incarceration or outside can sometimes inspire people to change.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we need to ensure that they're treated with dignity. How can we balance these two areas of knowing, in a sense, that sometimes people actually won't change until they've reached rock bottom, but also knowing that human dignity is important? Um, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not sure I accept the tension between the two. And I'm not
Mhm.
sure I fully accept the premise about rock bottom. Let me explain what I
Mm.
mean. I think that if you like on a descent into addiction or persistent offending, there are probably many possible moments of diversion out
Mhm.
of that path. One expert in violence reduction in Scotland likes to talk about the teachable moments, the moments
Mhm.
when the right the right person meeting meeting the person in trouble at the right moment in the right way can have a profound effect, and I think that's right, and I think that often what it takes is people who have the capacity to model hope, and to communicate kindness. In fact, I have a recently completed PhD in Glasgow by a researcher called Sarah McKean, and she was looking at hope, um, drawing theology and criminology together. You might be interested to learn. And
Yes.
she discovered that one of the things which generated hope in hopeless people, people caught up in hopeless patterns of addiction and imprisonment, was small acts of unexpected mercy. So
Mm.
when somebody was treated with dignity at a moment when they didn't feel they deserved it,
Yeah.
and when they the person offering mercy also communicated belief in that person's potential and worth, capacity to develop and to grow and to change, to reinforce all of those messages at times when the person themselves can't believe in them,
Yeah.
might actually be the beginning of drawing them out of the descent into the pit, or it might happen at the bottom of the pit. And often
Yeah.
people do say that they have to go all the way down before they can start to climb out. But either way, people climbing out of the pit need ropes to be thrown down for them. And if you think, I think
Yeah.
of those as metaphors. There's a rope which is labeled hope, and there's one which is labeled love, and there's one which is labeled opportunity.
Mhm.
Because I think we can talk about negative experiences as triggers for desistance, and there's good research evidence to support that. Bereavement, for example, has sometimes been associated with desistance, imprisonment, sometimes in certain contexts. Um, but there's also plenty of research to suggest that people are pulled toward desistance by positive opportunities and by positive developments in their lives. So, in the classic example, a young man who's been getting into lots of trouble with a peer group who are involved in all sorts of difficulties, falls in love with a young woman who has a different moral system and is saying very clearly, if you want to be with me, you can't continue to behave in that way. The young man has a choice to make. Which
Mhm.
which relationship is he valuing more? The new romantic relationship or the relationship with the peer group? And if he chooses the romantic relationship and is more influenced by that, then he'll be pulled towards desistance, rather than propelled by negative events and circumstances. So I think you can have positive and negative triggers for desistance, but in both cases, in fact, having having the ability to develop your own capacities and strengths is one big part of it. The other part of it is having people around you who can who can help. And I think I once described that as being a bit like a boxer. You need people in your corner, and you need to know what you've got in your locker,
Mm.
if you're going to go into this fight. And it's both, not one or the other.
Yeah, yeah, and I do like the description of a fight because when we think about persons desisting, we think, oh, but they should, they should desist, they should live this life. We are living a better life, but in truth, what actually happens is they struggle more. You know,
Well, it's certainly a
at least
struggle, and
for a period of time.
if we were to extend the metaphor, you could talk about putting people into that fight with one hand tied behind their back and a blindfold, and and their shoelaces tied together. Because
Hmm.
I think that's a bit like what it feels like for many people trying to desist in the context of a criminal justice system that keeps on harming them and
Yeah.
damaging them, landing blows on them, if you like, and a wider society that is more interested in the spectacle of their suffering than the offering of opportunities to live differently. So yeah, I think that metaphor works quite well to show just why it's such a struggle, and such a fight for so many people to try and stay on that track.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier a little bit of what happens in Scotland in terms of increasing the awareness about what happens with former incarcerated persons. What else has Scotland done to help persons and facilitate persons leaving this life of crime?
Yeah, I'm always wary of holding up my own jurisdiction, much as I love Scotland. But I don't want to hold it up as some kind of paragon. I think the progress of desistance-based practice, as we sometimes call it here, is best described as partial.
Hmm.
But let me give you a few good examples. So, first of all, the fact that in Scotland, people who supervise probation and parole are social workers helps, because
Hmm.
as we were kind of alluding to at the beginning, social workers are trained to support processes of human development, but also to recognize the social environments in which they take place. That's core to what it is to be a social worker. So I think it's really good that in Scotland we have practitioners at the front line of supporting desistance who have that mentality and that general approach. I think a lot of the skill set that they bring to supervising people is is very constructive and very positive. But I think in Scotland, as in many Western jurisdictions, in the last 20 or 30 years, the preoccupation of the system has been with risk management and with public protection. And sometimes that's gone so far as to almost prevent social workers from taking positive risks to try to reintegrate people or to try to support people's desistance. So there's a kind of a mixed bag in that respect. Having said that, both in our prison system, in our kind of policy making circles, even in the context of our courts, practitioners and leaders in our justice system have been trained in desistance for the last 10 or 20 years. Most of them are very exposed to the ideas and are thinking about them and trying to implement them in various ways. So, for example, we have a recent sentencing guideline for sentencing people under the age of 25, which recognizes that people don't fully mature in psychological and social terms until their late 20s. Therefore, the way in
Mm.
which we think about criminal responsibility and the way in which we approach sentencing needs to take account of immaturity better. And so, for younger people, rehabilitation, according to this guideline, should be a principal concern in sentencing in the mix of different factors: retribution, deterrence, communication, rehabilitation, incapacitation. Rehabilitation is given more prominence for young people in Scotland, and I think that's partly related to desistance research.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
there are kind of areas of progress, but it's still taking place, I would argue, in the context of a kind of mood of public punitiveness and a willingness of
Mm.
some political actors to seek to exploit that mood rather than to try and educate people away from it. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's we're far from perfect in Scotland, I have to say.
We're working in, work in progress as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. What should a country think about incorporating in their policies if they want to help people who have broken the law to stop?
Well, I think this is a great question, and I'll answer it kind of negatively first, and then try to make more positive prescriptions. So the first thing I always say is stop making it worse by
Mm.
y- yielding to the pressure to be punitive, because every time that you yield to that pressure and you impose harm on people who've harmed others, you make desistance less likely. You make it harder to desist because
Hmm.
people then have to overcome the thing that they've suffered. They have to address or recover capacity or recover capability or recover social relationships that we have chosen to break or harm or damage by punitive measures. So, right from the earliest stages when we intervene with children in trouble and all the way through the system, I think we have to adhere to a principle that we seek to do no more harm than we absolutely must on grounds of public protection. So I understand and I accept that some people pose such serious risks that they need to be contained or constrained in certain
Hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
But even with those people, I would argue we have to be thinking about the long game of their reintegration and acting in ways that don't make that more difficult than it needs to be. So that's my first principle. Beyond that, I think my second sort of core principle is to say, I think crime is a source, a sign, and a symptom of relational problems. So
Mm.
when a crime occurs, obviously social relationships are almost by definition being damaged and broken. You're entitled to expect me not to take your property or not to assault your person. If I do that, the relationship between us is damaged until something happens to repair it. But beyond that, a lot of the things which drive offending result from prior relational breakdowns. Either the state has failed to provide for a child in terms of the
Hmm.
development of that child and that child's socialization or education or opportunities, or there might be relational problems in the family or in the community. So relational problems are all over our crime problems. And again, we want to make sure that the way that we respond to that doesn't make relational problems worse. So I think I would say always attend to the relational. Think about the rupture that you're trying to repair. So think of it as a tear in the social fabric, and you can either tug at it and make the hole bigger, or you can start stitching. And stitching is painful on both sides of the tear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you know, we can't avoid that because suffering has been caused, and prior suffering is also implicated here. So, yeah, first of all, do less harm. Second, always attend to the relational dynamic. And I guess I would say, thirdly, when you when you exercise power over people through the criminal justice system, try to do it in a way which is respectful and dialogical. So, in work that I'm doing on rehabilitation at the moment, it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that for rehabilitation to be effective, the person involved in the process has to feel and be recognized as a
Mm-hmm.
worthy and dignified human being, even if that's not the way that they're behaving. Um, Recognition comes first, and out of recognition comes the possibility of dialogue. So, in a process of rehabilitation, if I'm the social worker and you're the offender, it needs to be a dialogue between us. We need to be interlocutors in a conversation about what it will take for peace to break out between you and society.
Yeah.
And then we have to plan a path to that destination together. I think at the moment, my fear is that a lot of what is done in the name of rehabilitation is monological and
Mm.
didactic, where I tell you how you need to change, and that you're not getting out till you change, or you won't get any help until you change, or um, it's all on you, basically, as we were discussing earlier. So I think that understanding that you don't repair relational ruptures without dialogue. And you can't have dialogue unless you found it on the basis of recognition, respect, and dignity. So these sound quite philosophical in a way, but actually, I think that they're fundamental. They're so fundamental that we can't do anything useful without them. Um, because if I try to rehabilitate you through a monologue or a lecture, well, you know what your reaction is going to be. I know what mine would be. It would be,
Yeah.
who do you think you are, telling me how to live my
Mm-hmm.
life? What do you know about my life? Have you lived in my life? Have you walked in my shoes? Did you have my upbringing? Do you know what it's like to be drug addicted? Do you know what it's like to be stigmatized everywhere you go? Do you know what it's like to have adversarial encounters with the police every day? Do you know what it's like to be rejected from hundreds of job applications?
Yeah.
And these are all perfectly reasonable challenges that can come from the person uh, who's who, who's in the offender box to those that are trying
Mm-hmm.
to support them. So I think recognition, dignity, dialogue all come first, and then we can move towards relational repair.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely importance in recognizing our role in creating harm, prior to their own involvement, because it means that when we are doing this kind of relationship building and negotiation, we are, in a sense, it humbles us and it makes us aware that there are behaviors and attitudes and mindsets that we need to challenge and be aware of and adjust in order to not just intervene and to facilitate and support somebody as they leave this life of crime, but
Yeah,
also crime prevention in terms of preventing other persons from going into and becoming persons who are involved in criminality.
yeah, and I think the other dynamic here that we could add is that the same is true in a way for people who have been victims of crime.
Yep.
Sometimes, and there's plenty of evidence on this, that when the state takes hold of the event and starts processing it through criminal justice, the victim feels just as alienated and excluded and silenced as the offender.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that doesn't, to my mind, respect or recognize their dignity and worth and their potential to be part of the process of deciding what reparation or restoration might be possible and appropriate. So I think these kind of principles have very broad reach in thinking about how we respond more constructively to crime and harm, and indeed they extend beyond the crime. Sorry, they extend beyond the harms that we currently criminalise to significant harms that we might not criminalise. In terms of things like pollution or health and safety at work, or there's many examples where corporations are causing the harm, or where governments are causing the harm, um, and in those contexts too, we need the same principles to guide how we sort things out between us, essentially.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think you've mentioned a few, but I'll still ask you just in case there are others. What do you believe are some barriers to the creation and application of effective desistance informed policies, which we'll also talk a little bit more about later?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two big barriers are uh, punitiveness as a sort of subcategory of public attitudes, and I'll come back to that in a moment and qualify it slightly, and politics. So to take the
Mm,
punitiveness end first, um, I don't actually believe that people are generally punitive,
mhm,
even in late modern societies, which sociologists sometimes characterize as being full of fear and anxiety, and uncertainty. I think that when presented with individuals with complex stories who do damaging things in specific circumstances, people can respond to that in ways which are quite enlightened, quite progressive, quite sensitive, quite thoughtful, and quite relational, but only because they have depth and detail. And I think that when people are deprived of depth and detail, and when they're given stereotypes or caricatures to respond to, then they respond with punitiveness. As we were saying
mm,
earlier, sometimes they respond with fear, sometimes they respond with anger, hostility, and so on. So there's a problem here, which is that punitiveness is broad but not deep, if you see what I mean.
mhm. Yeah.
And if we could just get deeper, we could get past that surface layer of punitiveness into the spaces and places where we actually are prepared to think about more deeply and constructively about how to do justice. Um, but that's the broad but not deep punitiveness is still a big problem because it gets in the way. And the reason it gets in the way is that politicians know that they can mobilize it for their own purposes. Politicians are
Mm,
very good at identifying how to excite a fearful population by promising them safety or protection or vengeance. Actually, they don't usually call it vengeance; they would usually call it justice or um, hard punishment or something that sounded tough. And people do respond
mhm,
to
tough.
that kind
Mhm,
of to that offer of protection and of a sort of satisfaction that might come from seeing supposedly bad people suffer. And politicians intuitively know that they can mobilize those emotions for their own political ends. And that's a dynamic that's really hard to shift. If you talk to politicians privately with evidence um, about what might be wise criminal justice policies to pursue, quite often, in my experience, you'll have a very thoughtful, reasonable, and sensible conversation. And then you kind of leave the room, and the same people are on television the next day, and you can't recognize the difference between the private discourse and the public discourse. And yeah, I find that as a criminologist who's trying to be active in the public sphere, I find that one of the most depressing and difficult aspects of our work. Um, how do we get politicians to be just a little bit more brave and to show just a little bit more leadership in the public sphere rather than kind of reverting to the base or the lowest common denominator,
Yeah.
appealing to our weaker, baser, more vindictive instincts, rather than trying to help to cultivate our better selves, essentially,
Mhm.
as a public. Yeah, those would be the two things that I think are most fundamental as barriers to reintegration. There's lots of practical things we could talk about in relation to criminal records and how we deal with them, in relation to employment opportunities, in relation to systems of education, in relation to availability of public housing, public assistance, the quality and range of social work provision at all stages of the life course. There's an endless list of things that criminologists might call states to account for.
Mm.
But those two, punitiveness and its political mobilization, strike me as being really, really thorny problems to get to grips with.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I mean, as we close this episode, in your work, you speak about different characteristics that need to be included in desistance-informed policies. Could you share with us what those characteristics are and explain them a little bit in terms of their practicality?
Okay, so we over the years with other colleagues, I've kind of tried to distill this list into a set of core principles, and I'm just doing this from memory, so hopefully I won't forget too many. But the first one is be realistic.
Hmm.
It's not easy to shift entrenched behaviors of any kind, and we all know that, right? When we try to diet or exercise more or drink less, it's not easy when we're locked in a pattern, even one that we identify as self-destructive. It doesn't make it easy to change it. So got to be realistic about that, recognize the likelihood of lapses and setbacks, and be thoughtful about how we manage those. Um, Secondly, we know that it's desistance is different for people in different circumstances with different assets and resources. It's different for people in different cultures. It's different across gender. It's probably different in relation to sexuality and disability, although we don't have quite so much evidence about that yet. So we need to individualize the kind of support that we offer for desistance, and take seriously how the person we're working with understands where they are and how they get where they want to go. So, yeah, realism, individualization. Thirdly, we need to foster agency. There's
Hmm.
evidence that as people move from persistent offending to desistance, they acquire a sense of control over their own lives. And we want to encourage that, because while people feel that they're kind of tossed around on the waves, unable to influence things, they're less likely to invest significantly in change. So we need to cultivate this sense of agency, and that's partly why dialogue is so important, because if we negotiate over the content of a sentence plan, for example, and give people some capacity to exercise some self-determination in those spaces, however constrained they might be, that's good. Fourthly, I've already mentioned the role of hope in desistance processes. It's really critical that people develop a sense of hope and a positive disposition towards their potential future. And sometimes, in the bleakest moments, in the pit, as we were saying earlier, the social worker or the correctional officer has to be a kind of reservoir for hope if no one else is fulfilling that function. Um, Relatedly, we need to recognize people's strengths and capacities and not be solely preoccupied with risk factors or even with needs. Both of those things are important and both need to be addressed, but it's also critical to identify people's strengths and their interests and then to mobilize those in desistance. Desistance is relational, as I've been saying throughout, so we need to attend to the social relationships that people have and that matter to them and work with partners, families, churches, communities, whoever's willing to be in the corner, as I was saying, um, and draw them into the process. That's linked to the significance of social capital in desistance, the resources that reside in our social networks. We've got to mobilize those. And then lastly, when desistance happens, even in the early stages, we need to celebrate it and certify it
Hmm.
and recognize it and let people know that we think they're doing well or even that we think they're doing better. because people caught up in criminal justice are used to an endless cycle of negative reinforcement. They're constantly being told that they are worthless, useless, liabilities, dangers, threats, burdens, and we need to shift that narrative. And one of the ways that we do that is by celebrating and recognizing success when we see it, even small steps. So, yeah, the more that we can recognize and certify progress, the more I think people begin to believe in their own journey and invest more in it. So those are my core principles.
And I think at the basic, at the foundation, it's just to remember that persons involved in criminality or offending persons, they're humans just like us. So a
Yeah,
lot of what you just described doesn't just apply to them in these special circumstances,
yeah.
but just to all of us as humans. We all desire to our strengths and our progress to be recognized. Sorry, go ahead.
No, completely. I think that, I mean, a lot of the time, sometimes when people are challenging me about my interest in rehabilitation and saying that's just another way in which the system makes everything an individual problem, a problem of the person, uh, and it reduces everything to that. One of the ways that I respond to that is to say, well, obviously that's not how I define rehabilitation, but also the reason I'm interested in rehabilitation is that I need it.
Hmm.
And I need it because I'm a human being, and I sometimes damage my relationships because of the way that I behave, and I need to understand how to get back or move on. You know, if relationships are irreparably
Probable.
broken,
Hmm.
sometimes you have to move on. That's also that's also sometimes the case. But fundamentally, rehabilitation is everyone's concern
Yeah.
because I've never met a person that didn't sometimes need it. Now, I'm not saying that we've all committed grievous offences, and I'm not saying that there aren't differences where people have been involved in very serious offences. But there are differences of degree, not differences of type.
Right.
So, I think these processes of human development, how we all flourish individually and collectively, and how we live in well functioning societies that look after each other rather than harming each other. Everybody's in that game, right? And
Hmm.
everybody has an investment in it, and everybody messes up, and everybody needs uh, at times a way back from the ways in which they've messed up. So I think yeah, that's core to my belief system and core to the way that I approach desistance is the recognition that this is a problem for all of humanity, um, and that I'm not in the business of creating or colluding in the creation of subcategories of human being who are somehow different or
Mm.
even worse, lesser than others. I think
Yeah.
we've been down that track many times in the history of humanity, and we don't want to be going there anymore.
Yeah. Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Professor McNeil. This was truly insightful. And I think what's important and what really stands out to me is just particularly, I know, in terms of our own role as civil society in this process. And, as you've spoken about, the media has conditioned our minds to perceive persons involved in criminality a particular way. But encounter can help to open our minds, change our mindsets and our hearts, um, to work with and to, change our attitudes and perspectives about them. And that's critical because we, as you said before, not everybody would be a criminal justice social worker or researcher. Some of us may never directly interact with persons who have been involved in criminality, but the way we speak about them, the way we transfer particular types of perspectives to our children or to others does impact the larger perspective and way in which they're treated in society. And so I think that is very important. And of course, I think your whole perception of personal, social, moral, and legal rehabilitation is key because again, it speaks to a number of human development factors that are key to change. And again, not just for persons involved in criminality, but all of us. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I know you have distant voices. Could you tell us just a little bit about distant voices and your latest book?
Okay, well, Distant Voices, you can find out all about it. We have a website which is distantvoices.org or .uk, distantvoices.org.uk, and it was a project between 2017 and 2021 where we explored and tried to practice reintegration after punishment through creative processes and through community building associated
Mhm,
with creative processes. As I mentioned earlier, the main creative practice was to do with songwriting. So we brought musicians into justice contexts to co-write songs with people with direct experience of criminal justice, whether as offenders or victims or families or practitioners or academics for that matter. And we all got together and wrote together and shared our experiences as expressed and represented in songs. And we took those songs into public contexts, festivals, some very large performances and some tiny performances, house concerts for a dozen people.
mm,
We made a podcast series called The Art of Bridging, which you can find
mhm,
on all the usual platforms. And we also recently published learning resources, which take each episode of the podcast and break it up and uh, link to materials that relate to each episode so that classes or groups can work through those materials if they'd like to learn more. So yeah,
mhm,
all that stuff's on the website, and that project has now concluded. Although the organisation that hosted the practice and the community still persists. It's called Vox Liminis, which is Latin
mhm.
for Voices from the Threshold, and I'm still a very active member of that community. In fact, this being a Tuesday evening that we're recording this, at least in UK time, I would normally be heading off to our regular Tuesday evening meal about now
Oh,
to eat and uh, meet and then make music or some other kind of creative activity with the community of people that we've formed around those activities, and that is my community. That's where much of my own life is lived and processed around people who thankfully are quite different from me and have different life experiences and who enormously enrich not just my understanding but my life altogether. So yeah, I think in a way that project has been as transformative for me as it has been for anybody else. But maybe that also speaks to my need for rehabilitation, as I was discussing earlier. So yeah, it's a good place to end,
yeah.
I guess.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, listeners and viewers, for participating and joining in this insightful session. Truly, I hope you will be able to take some of what Professor McNeil has said and figure out how we can apply this to our daily lives. Feel free also to share the content, like the content, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Safe for Tomorrow. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.